best for last, meaning that the normal family time that we have, we're going to do it at the end, and we're going to flow into our Thanksgiving celebration. You like that? Good. I see a lot of new faces. Anyway, we're going to have some welcome at the end. But if you're here for the first time, will you just wave your hands? The rest of us, we just want to welcome you. There you go. There are quite a few first-timers. Welcome. Good. And we actually have a guest all the way from Switzerland today, too. Rocky, will you just wave your hands? All the way from Switzerland, just to celebrate. Is there any way we can make the room a little brighter? I think it's a little dark. I don't want to fall asleep. This is a very difficult hour for me. Okay, that's good. If you have your Bible, we actually have them on the screen as well. We're going to read a passage. Some of you are very familiar with this passage, but from Philippians chapter 2. We'll read this passage together. My version might be a little different, so go ahead and just read it. Whatever you see on the screen, and I'll read along. Chapter 2, verse 12 through 18. Let's go ahead and read it together.
Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvations with fears and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose. You do everything without grumbling and arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in the world and the crooked generations. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. And as you hold firmly the word of life, and I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run on labor in vain, but even if I am being poor on my faith, offer on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith. I am glad and rejoice with all of you, so you too shall be glad and rejoice with me.
Great. Well, this is the beginning of a Thanksgiving celebration. Are you ready to gain some weight? Starting today, I think this might be our early celebration. We actually had a huge gathering with some of the young people yesterday, and we already started with turkey and candied yam, but this is a season to count our blessing, and we're going to do that. I want to share with you this really interesting research that was done a few years ago. How many of you heard of the science of gratitude? No one here? You have, huh? Actually, this research started in 2007 under a very renowned psychologist, a doctor, Robert Emmons, who really led this research. And it started in 2007 in the University of Berkeley. And I think it was a joint project with University of Davis, California Davis. And it's a really fascinating story. They actually wanted to clinically, scientifically measure the effect or impact of Thanksgiving, gratitude. So, in fact, this research has been going on for about 9 years now, and they just released the result of the very first phase of their study in 2014. So this is actually very, very new, but the way they actually did this research was that they gather a group of test subjects, and they divide them into 3 groups. So the first group was called the gratitude group, and then the second group was called the hassle group. And then the last group was the neutral. They called them control group. And so they evenly divided 3 groups of people. And what they did is at the end of each day and each week, they would actually have them journal. So the gratitude group will actually recount and think about something that they're thankful for. And whether it's like a simple thing or something profound, they would actually journal about the things that happen in their life that they're thankful for. So that was the gratitude group. And then the middle group, or the hassle group, were the ones who were actually requested to journal the things that hassle them. The things that they bother them. Anything negative that happened or things that are bothering them, They actually had them write and journal about these things, and then the control group or the neutral group were just left alone. They did not write anything. They were just like the rest of us who are going about doing the business. So at the end of this research, they discover something really, really fascinating. Those people who actually were part of the gratitude group, their mental health, their stress level, their physical strength, and even some of their sickness and their health level actually went up drastically. Whereas the hassle group, who were actually supposed to write down all the things, negative things that are happening in their lives, their actually level of stress went up. Their relational health actually went down. Their physical health was going down. So it was an interesting story, and then they did another test where they actually gathered people who are experiencing some level of muscular dystrophy or muscular sickness, people like who are suffering from like chronic fatigue syndrome. And they discover also that just by writing down things that they're thankful for, that somehow their physical health went up drastically, even without relying on medicine. So because of this discovery, they actually started this movement, and you can find out, you can Google, and some of you are already Googling on your phone, but there's actually a movement called the Greater Good, and they're actually promoting people to be thankful. So they provide video resources and writings about their discovery, and just by simply having just a lifestyle of gratitude, that you can actually fight a lot of physical, emotional, relational stress in your life. So that alone is enough reason for us to be thankful in this season. Now you may be wondering, why am I talking about this? Is it because we're entering into the week of Thanksgiving? Of course. It is a season of Thanksgiving. And in a few days, you're going to be gathering with your family members, your friends, and you're going to be counting your blessings. And even apart from all the spiritual impact, I want you to realize the benefits of being grateful, being thankful. But today, I want us to really go one step further. And I want to explain to you that yes, there are physical benefits. Yes, there are emotional and even mental benefits that come from being thankful. But there is actually one thing that we really need to understand and realize. And when you think about this art or science of Thanksgiving, it impacts all of us in a very, very profound way. And it actually impacts our spiritual health as well. Now, most of you know, there are a lot of immigrants here. Do you remember how Thanksgiving started? What are we celebrating? Do you remember how the first Thanksgiving actually started? I think it was about over 400 years, close to 400 years ago. It was actually the very first pilgrims that came from the Great Britain to start a new life here in America. Do you remember how many of people actually made the first voyage? If I'm correct, don't quote on this, but if I'm correct, I think it was 102 people who actually made their way here. And if you do a little bit of a study, the first Thanksgiving, the way it started, it was actually during the first year that the weather and their travel was so taxing, and they had such a difficult time, difficult challenges coming here, that more than half of the people who got on that voyage actually, they died. So, about half of the people who came over, within the first year of surviving and having their first crop, they actually declared 3-day feast called Thanksgiving. Well, back then they didn't call it Thanksgiving. It was a 3-day feast of giving thanks to God for His faithfulness. Now I want you to imagine this, how different the pilgrims, their spirit was different from our days. I want you to just imagine if I took you on a journey. Some of you went to Israel with me, right? 22 of us, we just came back from Israel. Just imagine as a leader that if I took you on a 22 journey and half of you did not make it back. Let's just assume, okay? The good thing is that everybody came back alive. But let's just assume that I took you on a trip on this voyage and half of you did not make it. If that happened today, There would be lawsuits going on, and you would be at least really, really angry at me. But when you look at the way the pilgrims actually celebrated, just because half of them survived, that they actually decided to set aside 3 days and give thanks to the Lord and celebrate and worship God. That's how Thanksgiving actually started. Now, there's another story of pilgrims that I want to share with you today that comes from the Bible. This is a much older story. It actually happened thousands and thousands of years ago. And it's a story that most of you are actually very familiar with. Which pilgrims am I talking about? The pilgrims that actually came out of the land of Egypt. Do you remember that story? How many of you watched the movie or the animation by Steven Spielberg, Prince of Egypt? Do you remember that story? The famous story, right? All the kids have watched growing up. And that's the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And that's another story of pilgrims that came out, that God's pilgrims. And do you remember how that story unfolded? Unfortunately, the movie, The Prince of Egypt, only tells half the story. These Israelites actually coming out. And it seems like it's a really happy ending story. But I want to remind you today, if you actually read it in the Bible, this is probably one of the saddest, most tragic events that actually happened in the Bible. The Bible tells us that there were actually 400,000 men that came out of Egypt, Exodus. Now, those 400,000, that's without counting children and women. So the scholars tell us that people that came out of Egypt, they were close to actually 2 million people. 2 million people who suffered under the evil regime of Pharaoh in Egypt. God had mercy on them, and God delivered them out of Egypt to lead them into the promised land. Almost 2 million people under the leadership of Moses. But the sad part, or the sad ending of the story, is that these people that came out of Egypt, do you remember how many people actually went into the promised land? Those people that came from Egypt, came out of Egypt? Only 2. Only 2 people out of almost 2 million people. All the first generation of people that came out from Egypt did not make it into the promised land. It was actually their children, their next generation. And only 2 people that Bible lists, Joshua and Caleb, were the 2 that were actually able to go into the promised land. And the other 198, I don't know, or 1,980,000, whatever, 999 or 98 people, they perished in the wilderness after circling in the desert for how many years? 40 years. 40 years. That is a significant story. That is actually one of the most tragic events that actually took place in the Bible. And the passage that we just read today, even though it may be really difficult to see, what Paul is talking about in this passage that we read is actually referring or going back to that original story, because some of the language that Paul uses here are actually straight from that Old Testament passages. Things like grumbling and complaining and depraved generation. Those were the same words that actually come out of Psalm 78 that actually speaks of this one event. Now, Paul talks about how the purpose of the church. He's actually writing this letter to a very, very young church just like ours. We're just 2 months into our new life here. Philippian church was actually also a very young church, and Paul is writing and charging this young church, and he says that you have to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So yes, Jesus saved us, but there's a part that you need to work out in your life, and he talks about what that working out salvation is. And then he reminds this young church what the purpose of our Christian life is, and he says, and this is my favorite part, it says, so that we may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation. And if you remember these words that I just read, blameless, pure children of God, and then crooked and depraved generation, some of those words are straight out of Psalm 78, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But in which we shine like stars in the universe as we hold out the word of life. It says that the purpose of the church, purpose of New Vine, is to shine like stars in this universe. Look around. Do you see shining stars sitting next to you? That's what we are. That's what Paul is saying about this young church. We are to shine like the stars in the universe. And that's the purpose. And what is really striking is Paul explains how we actually shine in this universe, in this world, as we hold out the word of life. And he explains in verse 14 what that is. And he says, do everything without grumbling and arguing. Whatever you do it without grumbling and arguing. The correct translation of that word in Hebrew or in Greek is that do everything without murmuring. Do you know what murmuring is? Have you ever murmured about anything? The words stay in your mouth like murmur, but it never comes out. That's what murmuring is. Children do that all the time, right? You tell your children to do something, what do? They murmur, right? They never say outright that I don't want to do it, but they murmur. But what Paul is saying is that it matters, but what is really important is not what we do or what we obey. You can obey everything that God commands us, but he says that in order for us to shine like the stars, we actually have to do it without murmuring, grumbling, arguing. Think about that. You can serve God. You can do all kinds of things, all kinds of service to the Lord, but if we become complaining, arguing, or murmuring, it is not pleasing to the Lord. So whatever we do, we have to do it in the spirit of peace. And you and I really need to understand this, because this passage that Paul is talking about actually it's just more than an advice. In fact, what he's teaching us here is that he's giving this as a warning to this young church. And the reason why he's taking this very seriously is because Paul is actually referring to this one particular event that happened in the Old Testament, and that comes from Numbers 11. When it talks about complaining, murmuring, grumbling, and because of that, how God's judgment came, there are only two places in the Bible. One is Numbers 11, and then the other is actually Exodus chapter 17. We don't have time to examine all these things, but we're going to look at just a summary of that. What Paul is talking about here is that our consequence of complaining or arguing as believers or as children of God is pretty profound. It's pretty significant. Because if you look at the history, as I said, none of the first generation of Israelites that came out of Egypt actually went into the promised land. This alone should be a significant warning for us. If we live our Christian life with murmuring and arguing and complaining, that means that all the promises that God has for us for our future may not be available for us. And Paul is saying that learn from the history of Israelites. I want you to think about this. These Israelites, if you study the book of Exodus, these 2 million people that came out of Egypt, they experienced all kinds of crazy miracles. Do you remember some of those miracles? When Pharaoh said, I will not let you go, Moses stands in front of this Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And what did he say? Let my people go. And when Pharaoh refused, do you remember what happened? God released 10 plagues into the land of Egypt, a great judgment. Israelites experienced that. They saw what God could do. And so Pharaoh finally let them go, right? But what happened? The army of Egypt actually chased after them, and his intention was to just destroy the Israelites from the face of the earth. And then the second miracle comes. Do you remember what the miracle was? God split the Red Sea in front of them and allowed the Israelites to actually walk through the dry land. Another incredible miracle. I want you to think about, we just came back from Israel, and we've been to Jordan and some of those Sinai Peninsula. And if you go to those places, it's like deadly place, desert where there's no water. It's just miles and miles of sand and dirt and mountains. There, Israelites wandered and God provided for them. Remember, they came out of Egypt as a slave. They did not bring much. Their sandals did not wear out. Whenever they needed to drink, there's no water in that part of the land. Just imagine how they actually survived for 40 years. God provided water for them. God provided food for them every day. Bread will fall from heaven called manna, and they ate from that bread daily. They experienced incredible miracles, and yet they still complain and murmur. This is why I believe that miracles do not change people's lives. You know, there are many people who will say that if I can just experience one miracle, that'll forever change my faith and my relationship with God. Let me tell you, I've experienced a lot of miracles in my own life. I've seen a lot of people who experience miracles, but those things do not change people. Only the real living relationship can change people's heart. So, even after all those miracles, Israelites complained, and they particularly, Paul is pointing to this one event in Numbers 11 where people were just getting tired of eating manna. So what they do is they start complaining and murmuring. We want meat. We want to eat meat. So God actually brings quail from all different directions, and they go and eat their meat to content, but God had to release this judgment as a sign, as a lesson. Do you know that if you actually look at the map of Israel and that whole Sinai Peninsula, do you know for Israelites to actually come out of Egypt and cross over to get into that promised land where currently Israel is, do you know how long it would actually take for them to actually make that journey? It's not a huge distance. It would actually take, at most, it would have taken about 10 days. With children and women, maybe a month. How many years did they spend in the wilderness? 40 years. And do you know why it took so long for them to actually possess the promised land? The Bible is very clear on that. Do you know what it is? Because they murmured. They murmured against God. They complained against God. Even after all those miracles and all those miraculous provisions. That's what it says in Psalm 78. Let's just read that. Do we have that, Tatiana? Let's have it. My version is, let's go ahead and read those few verses from verse 17 through 22. Go ahead and read it in one voice. You know, it's really interesting in these few verses, the psalmist says, they call grumbling and murmuring a sin of rebellion. It says that they rebelled against God. And then it goes on to say that it's actually they did not believe in God's salvation. I mean, these are pretty radical claims. It's saying, the Bible is actually telling us that when we grumble and murmur against God, it's almost like we're rebelling against Him, and then it's almost as if we never actually believed in God and in His salvation. It's a contradiction of our faith in God. And that's why they were not able to enter into the promised land. Even though this sounds really harsh, I think this is really one of the most profound truths that we need to really take a hold of. This is why the Bible tells us that we ought to be thankful at all times. We can actually rejoice all the time. I don't know how many of you consider yourself as a complainer? Have you done any complaining? Is there anyone who has not complained in this room? Is there anyone who has not murmured? We have, right? We have. It is actually God's grace that we're still here. And God is giving us a second chance. Many of us might not see ourselves as a complainer, or at least, we don't outright start complaining in front of other people. We've actually been pretty well trained or conditioned to hold our grudges or our murmuring just to ourselves. But let me just share with you, there are actually 3 different types of complaining or murmuring. And I got to be honest with you, all of us, every single one of us have actually committed one of these type of complaining. We actually fall into this kind of complaining all the time. But 3 types of complaining. If you somehow believe that you've never complained or you don't murmur, here are 3 things that you can kind of look at, how the Bible actually defines what murmuring or complaining is. And actually, all of those 3 things actually happen in the book of Numbers 11 and 12. So you can go back and study. And actually, this is the event that I've been talking about. The first type of complaining or complainers are the ones that I would call whiners. You know what whining is? Not drinking wine, but whiners. Children whine, adults whine. Everybody whines at some point, right? Whiners, they believe that I deserve better than this. That's the attitude. That's the underlying attitude. I am tired of eating this. I am tired of eating manna. What is that? That's whining. I am tired of listening to Pastor Ted every Sunday. What is that? That's whining. It's only been 8 weeks. Do you feel that way? No? I'm tired of listening to the same guy every single Sunday. That's whining. And we all, fall into that kind of grumbling. Here it's really interesting that you look at that story in Numbers 11. These Israelites began to have this gift of creative memory. Creative memory is remembering something that actually never happened. Do you remember what they were saying? They said, in Egypt, we actually ate meat. We ate garlic and we ate all this choice food. But remember, who were they? They were slaves. They never had meat. Their hearts are so disgruntled that they begin to think of these memories that actually never exist or never happened. And that's the kind of the complaining that we see in Numbers 11. The second type of complaining is, or people who complain are what I call martyrs. Do you know who martyrs are? There are a lot of martyrs in this world too. People who feel like no one understands me. No one appreciates me. I am the only one. Do you ever feel that way? Sometimes I feel that way too. No one understands how much I go through to preach 3 messages on Sunday and come here in the afternoon, and I'm so exhausted and tired at the end of the day. We all fall into that kind of martyr syndrome. Nobody understands me. I'm the only one who's doing this. Moses fell into that sin. If you look at the history of Israelites, Moses, this great leader who led God's people out of Egypt, he never gets to go into the promised land. And if you pay careful attention, one of the reasons why he did not get to go in was because he became a martyr. His self-proclaimed martyr. Listen to what he says in chapter 11. He says in front of God, "Why did you bring these troubles to me?" It's Moses speaking to God. "Did I conceive all these people? Did I give birth to them? If this is how you're going to treat me, kill me right here, right now." This is Moses contending against the Most High God. And sometimes we do that too. I've done that in my own life. And the third type of complainers are what I call fault finders. Who are these people? They can walk into a room, any room, and then they look around and they can find things that are not right. Are there any fault finders here in this room? Let's be honest. Let's be real. Right? There are people like that. One time I was actually looking at this amazing picture of Ansel Adams. This beautiful landscape picture that's like life-size almost. I was standing there and looking at, just mesmerized by the picture and the color. And then this one guy comes in and stands right next to me and he says, "The frame is wrong. The mat is not cut right. The proportion is not right." And he begins to just point out all the things that are not right. And he probably missed out the actual beauty, the artwork. Now, there are people like that who can walk in, and that may be a gift, or that may be a weakness, but hear me out. When you transfer this kind of mentality on people, you really become a complainer. The first thing that you see in people's lives is their weaknesses and their faults, and then we have a problem. This affects our relationship. This affects our marriage. This affects our parenting. All kinds of relationships, even within the church, because we are so good at fault finding. When we talk about a vision or dream or direction that God is giving us, there will be people, I can guarantee you, there will be people who come and explain to me why it won't work. And this is why we actually end up dividing the body of Christ and become very, very wounded. And these kind of fault findings can actually destroy our relationship in the community. It actually happened to the Israelites too, among even the leadership. Moses had two other people, Aaron and Miriam. Aaron was his right-hand man, Miriam was Moses' sisters. But remember what these two people did? They actually complained against Moses because Moses had a colored wife, a Gentile wife. So, in fact, actually, that also happens in chapter 11 and 12, that they come and they complain to Moses, and they actually complain against God. Has the Lord spoken only to Moses? Do you remember Moses? He married a Gentile. He broke the law. All of us can go into that kind of complaining and grumbling. And these kind of things can actually destroy the community life that God is building here. 3 things that will actually prevent even New Vine from really experiencing all that God has in store for us, for our future, can be destroyed by these kind of complaining and murmuring. I want you to consider the situation that Paul was in. When he was writing this letter, just like how I explained to you last week, it was extraordinary circumstances. He was actually writing this letter in prison. Actually, much of his letters were written in prison when he was chained. Paul started out his life as a promising young man with the highest education. He was a lawyer of his day, and the law in those days were actually the law of God. So he had all the he was the Pharisee of the Pharisees, and then he has this encounter with the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus, where he was on his way to persecute the Christians. He leaves everything behind, and he begins to follow Jesus. And now, his life begins to fall apart. All the promise of the educations and his training just went out the window. And he begins to be persecuted, and he begins to be hated, and he's ridiculed. And now he ends up in prison. And he's charged with a religious crime. And that's when he writes these letters. And he says, I am glad, in the beginning of the letter, he says, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. Again, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul describes his own life. You look at what he's going through at the moment, he actually has no reason to be thankful for. His life was literally falling apart. And yet, this is how he describes his own life. He says, I am pressed on every side, but not crushed. I am perplexed, but not in despair. I am persecuted, but I am not abandoned. I am struck down, but I am not destroyed. How amazing is that? When you go through trials in life, unreasonable sufferings, or you're confused, you're perplexed at what is happening in your life. Feel like you're getting pressures from every side. Can we rejoice? Is it possible to give thanks to God? Do you remember what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5? He says, rejoice always. Not just rejoice at times, rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. And then he says, give thanks to God in all circumstances. And he goes on to say that this is the will of God in Christ Jesus. This is the will of God for you. To be rejoicing at all times, to be praying without ceasing, and to give thanks to God in all circumstances. How can we be thankful even when things are not going right? How can you be thankful when your father is going through cancer? How can we be thankful when we have lost our job? How can we be thankful when we feel like we're running out of resources, finance? How can we be thankful when our important relationships in our lives are falling apart? You know what the key is? For Christians, for the children of God, we do not look to the past. We look to the future. That's the only way. The worldly gratitude, the worldly thanksgiving is always looking back to the past. What has happened? What God did for me? What happened in my life? For believers, for the children of God, that's not the kind of thanksgiving that Paul is talking about here. When he says that I am pressed on every side, but I'm not crushed. I am perplexed, but I'm not in despair. I'm persecuted, but I'm not abandoned. I'm struck down, but I'm not destroyed. He is looking to the future. That's why he was able to rejoice. That's why he was able to give thanks to God. Jesus, Hebrews, it says the same thing. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He went to the cross because of the joy that was set before him. And that's the kind of life that God is calling us to live. Not because something wonderful happened in our lives, or we get depressed, we get angry because something did not happen or something terrible happened in our life. But because God's promise and his faithfulness endures. I want us to spend some time just reflecting on some of these words. And this is how I want us to go into family time. If you can just take a few moments. If you have a journal, if you have a piece of paper, if you need some, just raise your hand. Or if you have your smartphone, you can pull that out as well. But I want us to just spend a few moments, maybe just a few minutes, just looking at our lives. How can we thank God for in this season of Thanksgiving? In a way that is radically different from how the world celebrates. What are the promises that you're holding on to in God, in Christ Jesus? Maybe some of you are going through a really difficult time right now, and your heart says, I don't want to be grateful. Look to the future. Look to the future promise that Jesus holds for you. And can you just journal some of the things that you can really thank God for? The things that we take for granted. Family, a community, friends, even the rain that we had this morning, today. The fact that we have a place where we can gather to worship God. That we have a community. We get to have a Thanksgiving meal together today in a few minutes. Let's spend some time just coming before the Lord, gathering our hearts and just offering this heart of gratitude towards God. And then I'm going to ask Douglas to come and lead us in a just a family time.